What's going on, and welcome to the next module in Story Selling Secrets. And so last time I told you I was going to tell you why stories are so powerful and what they actually do inside of the brain. And before I get into it, so basically I want to tell you, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about why stories are so powerful in the brain. And this is super important because once you understand why, you'll understand how to use your stories to elicit the response that you're looking for. And the other thing that I want you to know is how to use this, right? I want you to have a practical application for how to take this and use it in your normal everyday life. And what will happen is you'll start noticing that you can pull people in quickly, and you can get people to pay attention, and you can get people to do things based on telling them a story, right? And a lot of times they won't even know. And so what happens is anytime that we have some kind of anticipation, there's a shot of dopamine in our brain, right? It's a hit of dopamine. That's why when we get a text message, we want to pick up our phones really fast, or when we get a notification on Instagram, we're quick to check it, or we want to see how many likes, or we scroll. All of those things, the mystery, the unknown, gives us shots of dopamine. And dopamine is the same hormone that's released into our brains as when like someone takes a hit of cocaine, right, or snorts some crack or whatever. I don't know how those drugs work, but when someone hits these drugs, they get a big shot of dopamine, right? And the same thing happens when we get cell phone notifications and stuff. But the funny thing is, the same thing happens when someone begins to tell us a story, right? When there's something that we're anticipating. So if I told you, hey, last night was the craziest night of my life, and I learned something that changed my life forever. And if you're interested, right, if that interests you, well, now I've given you a shot of dopamine, and you want to know what comes next. Okay, tell me more. What happened, right? What happened, man? And so that's the first thing is anytime you initiate a story, you give someone a shot of dopamine, especially if you have a really curiosity-based hook that you're pulling them in with, right? Hey, man, yesterday was insane, bro. Insane. Have you ever had a friend start off a conversation like that and you're like, damn, really? What happened? You know what I mean? You're either skeptical, like, what'd you do, man? Or you're like, whoa, really? Depending on who the person is, right? But it starts with the hook. And then stories can take people in different directions, right? So there's certain types of stories that they can take people in two different directions in terms of what's going on in the brain. One of them is when you tell a funny story, right? When you tell a funny story, there are endorphins released inside of the brain. And endorphins are like the happy, the good mood, hormone, right? Endorphins make people happy and excited. If you ever been at the gym and you freaking busting your butt and then you leave and you feel like you're on top of the world and you can crush anything, that's because your body got a release of endorphins into your brain, and they actually produce a better mood. And that's when you have funny stories, right? Or you have feel-good stories, right? Those release endorphins into the brain. The other kind of stories are when you tell something sad that elicits basically it elicits oxytocin or empathy, right? So oxytocin is another hormone that goes into the brain, and oxytocin is responsible for empathy. And empathy is basically when you can put yourself in someone else's shoes, right? And so I'm going to tell you guys a story, and I'm going to tell you the same story in two different ways and show you how I can elicit the response. So I remember when I was I was probably 6 years old, right? And I didn't know what I was doing, man. I was just a little kid trying to figure the world out, right? And I had to go to school one morning, and I was on the toilet, and my grandma was like, AJ, hurry up. And I was sitting there, and I was like trying to finish, taking a dump, right? And I'm sitting there, and then I'm like, oh, shoot. I wipe my butt really quick. I put the toilet paper in, and I flush, and I wash my hands, run out of the bathroom, and I start walking to school, right? And I'm jogging to school, whatever. And then when I got to school, I remember, man, I sat down in my class, and when I sat down, I was like, some don't smell so right. And I hadn't wiped my ass all the way. I hadn't wiped my ass all the way. And I was like, man, the school was just beginning. And I didn't know what I was going to do because it really smelled bad. Like, no joke. Like, and I remember at lunchtime, man, one of my classmates came over and he's like, AJ, man, you step in dog shit or something? Right. I grew up in the hood. So, badass little kids. And he walked over and he's like, AJ, you step in dog shit or something? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, let me see your shoes. And I'm like showing him my shoes really quick because I don't want him to see that there's nothing there. And he's like, bro, there's no shit on your shoes. And I was like, so embarrassed. I didn't know. I'm 6 years old, man. I didn't know how to tell him, like, I freaking didn't wipe my ass all the way. And there was like shit. Like, I stunk like shit the whole day. And like, I remember that day was like one of the worst days of my life because I literally had to be at school all day smelling. And I just, from a little mistake I made in the morning, and I didn't know how to handle it. And that day really messed me up, man. I mean, okay, so I'm done. So that's one way to tell the story. And what I'm trying to do is elicit empathy, right? If you were like, I know some people, man, they'll laugh at anything, right? I'm one of those people that, the saddest thing in the world, unless it's like really, really, really heartbreaking, I'm not like a sadness. It's hard to tug at my heartstrings, right? But a story like that, if you are an empathetic person, you start feeling, you're like, man, that's messed up. I get it. I've been there, whatever, And then I'm going to tell you this story a different way. Yo, man, so when I was 6 years old, I remember I was in the toilet. I was in the freaking bathroom, wiping my butt, trying to finish my poo. My grandma's banging on the door. She's like, AJ, hurry up. You got to go to school. And I'm like, oh, shoot. So I wipe it, throw away, flush the toilet, wash my hands, and I start jogging to school. And then I go and I sit down in my first class. And when I'm sitting there, I'm like moving around and I'm smelling and I'm like, man, someone stinks, right? I'm like, someone stinks. And I'm like looking around and shit, I'm the only one. Nobody's by me. Nobody else has sat in their desk yet. And I realized, oh my God, I forgot to wipe all the poo out of my ass. So I remember I walked up, we went to lunch and I had a buddy come up and my buddy who's like, he sits next to me and he's like, AJ, man, what happened? You step in dog shit? And I'm like, yeah, I stepped in dog shit on my way to school, man. When I was walking, there was a big old pile and I accidentally stepped in it. And he's like, well, let me see your shoes, man. And I'm like, this motherfucker. And I'm like, okay. So I show him my shoes really quick, trying to pretend like there was dog shit on them. And he's like, I don't see dog shit. I'm like, can't you see this? Like right there. It's in the crevices. And he's like, bro, you didn't step in dog shit. And I'm like, you're right, man. I forgot to wipe my ass. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to go sit down and write down all the stories that you have in your life, because you have thousands of stories, entertaining stories, things that might have just been like normal for you or you forgot about that are absolutely powerful, right? So I want you to write down stories and put them into categories, right? Which ones are funny or entertaining or make people feel good, and which ones are sad and elicit empathy. Categorize them into these two categories so you have them and you know when to use them depending on the situation. With that, I'll see you on the next lesson. Peace.